The snow had not melted yet in the forests north of Khabarovsk, though the sun had already begun to break winter's hold. Birch trunks gleamed like bones beneath the morning haze, and the Amur River, still locked under its crust of ice, sent up mist that crawled through the trees. At 0640 hours, a radar operator of the 42nd Separate Air Defense Company, Sergeant V.K. Chernyshov, reported an anomaly, not a moving target, but a fixed echo, metallic and large, west of the Bira River Valley. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Petrov, chief engineer of the 24th Mixed Aviation Regiment, read the entry twice before dispatching a reconnaissance team. The war, to most men stationed in the Far East, seemed remote. Europe was burning, and the Red Army's battles against Japan were still 2 years away. Yet the Soviet Air Defense Forces kept a wary eye on the frontier, mindful of violations by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. "A new blip in the Tiger," the duty officer wrote, laconically. "Possibly wreckage." By noon, Petrov's Gaz-64 truck and a detachment of engineers and infantry reached the coordinates. What they found silenced even the most talkative conscripts. The aircraft lay splayed across a frozen clearing, the twin booms half buried in snow, the nose twisted and snapped. A red star, hand-painted by frost or illusion, flickered faintly on the ice, but beneath it, unmistakably, was an American white star and blue circle. Petrov walked slowly toward the wreck, crunching ice beneath his boots. The wingspan stretched more than 15 meters. The fuselage, though scarred and burnt, retained its shape. 2 nacelles housing engines, joined by a central pod containing a cockpit and armament bay. The twin tail booms, a feature no Soviet aircraft had ever possessed, rose like broken arms toward the tree line. He touched the cold metal, brushed away snow, and read the faint lettering stamped near the tail, Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, Burbank, California. In his logbook, he would later write, "We believed the Americans only flew Thunderbolts and Mustangs. We were wrong. This is something else entirely, a machine built for altitude and range, not for our kind of war." The discovery was extraordinary for several reasons. The Soviet Union had received thousands of aircraft through the Lend-Lease program, Bell P-39 Airacobras, Curtiss P-42s, Douglas A-22s, and the sturdy C-47 transports, but never the P-38. Washington had deemed it too complex, too valuable for European and Pacific operations. No P-38 had been officially delivered to Soviet hands. So, how had one reached this remote corner of Siberia? Petrov crouched beside the shattered cockpit. The canopy glass was missing. The seat belts had been cut. The cockpit instruments' dials marked in feet, miles per hour. Gallons were covered in frost but intact. The yoke was bent. The oxygen hose coiled like a snake around the rudder pedals. He removed a glove and traced the raised lettering on the control panel. Lockheed Electric Systems, Model P-38 G15LO. Behind him, Corporal Yudin shouted, "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, there's a serial plate here." He held up a small aluminum tag pried from the inner engine cowling. It bore the inscription, U.S. Army Air Forces, A. C. No. 42 to 12985. Petrov recognized the format instantly. He had seen similar tags on Airacobras unloaded at Vladivostok under Lend-Lease, though none had these long serial sequences. He instructed Yudin to photograph the markings with the regiment's single German Leica camera, a war trophy from Smolensk. Over the next hour, the engineers circled the wreck. The left boom had sheared off near the tail. The right engine nacelle was scorched but complete. The propellers, 3-bladed Curtiss electric models, had gouged deep furrows in the snowpack, frozen mid-rotation. There was no body, no sign of ejection, and no documents in the cockpit. When they pried open the port ammunition bay, they found 4 .50-caliber Browning machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm cannon, all mounted in the nose, the signature armament layout of the P-38 Lightning. Each gun bore a faint heat discoloration from firing. The empty ammunition chutes confirmed the aircraft had seen combat before crashing. But combat against whom? Japan? The weather? Or perhaps, unthinkably, Soviet defenses themselves. Back at the field camp, Petrov convened an impromptu meeting. Around a kerosene heater, he, Captain Vasiliev, chief mechanic, and Senior Lieutenant Bogdanov, political officer, debated the wreck's origin. Vasiliev: it could be one of the Americans returning from a reconnaissance mission over the Kurils. If it lost its bearings, the pilot might have strayed into our airspace. Bogdanov: or a Japanese copy. They build anything the Americans have. Petrov: no, the manufacturing is unmistakable. This is a Lightning. Bogdanov frowned. Lightning? Petrov explained. A twin-engine fighter. Designed by Lockheed, fast, very high ceiling, used by the Americans in the Pacific. I have read fragments in Aviacja I Kosmonautika. They say it flies higher than 35,000 feet. The political officer's notebook closed with a snap. Then this must not be discussed outside this room. Orders arrived within 48 hours from the regional headquarters of the Far Eastern Air Defense Command. The aircraft is to be recovered intact and transported to the aviation repair works at Komsomolsk on Amur. All personnel involved are to maintain strict confidentiality. The telegram bore the signature of Major General F.A. Kuznetsov. The next morning, under a rising wind, Petrov's team began the operation. Using sledges, ox-drawn tractors, and the help of 40 local laborers, they cut a path through the forest. The twin booms were lashed to logs to prevent further damage. Soldiers cleared a 50-meter trail down to the frozen river, where the wreck could be hauled by truck. It took 6 days. Each night, Petrov recorded his observations in his journal. He noted the precision of the rivets, the smoothness of the aluminum skin, the unfamiliar layout of hydraulic lines. He drew sketches of the turbo-supercharger, an advanced unit unknown in Soviet fighters. It looks like a snail made of nickel, one mechanic whispered. By April 13th, the wreck reached the edge of Khabarovsk's secondary airfield. Soviet officers from the technical directorate arrived to inspect it. One of them, Colonel N.M. Arseniev, carried a small folder of American aircraft recognition charts issued by the People's Commissariat for Foreign Trade. When he matched the silhouette twin tails, central pod to the drawing labeled Lockheed P-38, there was a pause. Then it's true, Arseniev murmured. The Americans have built a fighter that can fly where no Soviet plane can follow. Later, Petrov would reflect that a moment was when curiosity turned into calculation. If this aircraft could be made to fly again, and if its engines could be started, it might reveal something about the Americans' secret to high-altitude performance. That night, as wind howled through the hangar's broken slats, Petrov wrote one final line in his field log before the lights went out. We found an American ghost in our forest. Tomorrow, we will teach it to speak Russian. By the third day, the wrecked P-38 Lightning rested on a reinforced sled platform near the outskirts of the Khabarovsk airfield. The makeshift hangar, nothing more than a canvas and timber structure hurriedly erected by engineers and local laborers, rattled under gusts of Siberian wind. Petrov, standing amid a dozen mechanics and junior engineers, surveyed the aircraft with the practiced eye of a man trained to see potential even in ruin. The Lightning's fuselage, scarred and dented, revealed a truth the Soviet engineers had long suspected. This was not merely an American fighter. It was an instrument of altitude, endurance, and concentrated firepower, a machine unlike anything produced in Moscow or Tushino. The initial challenge was daunting. Soviet aircraft design philosophy emphasized simplicity and repairability under the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front. The P-38, in contrast, was a product of precision engineering, with thousands of components manufactured to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. The twin Allison V1000, 710 engines, each with turbo-superchargers, occupied space and complexity, unfamiliar to even the most experienced Soviet mechanics. Petrov's first inspection revealed broken oil lines, torn control cables, and twisted propeller hubs. The central cockpit nacelle had sustained severe impact, bending the pilot's seat rails and jamming the rudder pedals. Petrov organized the team into specialized units. One group disassembled the engines, labeling every cylinder, every bolt, while another examined the control surfaces. The tail booms, still partially buried in snow, were carefully lifted using a combination of oxen-drawn winches and sled pulleys. Every action was documented. Photographs were taken using the Leica and a newly issued Graflex, and sketches filled Petrov's logbook. Measurements were made down to millimeters, each recorded for later replication if the aircraft's design proved superior to existing Soviet fighters. By April 11th, the engineers discovered something immediately alarming. The P-38 was capable of flight well above 30,000 feet. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft, the Yakovlev Yak-9 and Lavochkin La-5, reached operational ceilings of 31,000 to 32,000 feet, but only with severely reduced maneuverability and engine reliability. The twin Allison engines of the Lightning, paired with their exhaust-driven turbo-superchargers, indicated that this aircraft could maintain full-rated power at 35,000 feet and beyond. Petrov realized that the Americans had designed a machine that exploited the thin air in ways the Soviets had not yet mastered. Captain Vasiliev, the chief mechanic, noted the durability of the aircraft's structure. Even with the landing skid broken, booms sheared, and the fuselage dented, this frame remains mostly intact, he said, running his gloved hand along the central nacelle. If our La-5 had taken this kind of impact, it would have split like kindling. Petrov's journal recorded his first thoughts on the implications. The P-38 is a testament to American philosophy. Mass production married to overbuilt precision. They do not fear loss, they build more, faster, and stronger. We must understand its construction before considering replication. The following day, the field team began an exhaustive inventory. Components were removed systematically: wing spars, hydraulic lines, gun synchronizers, and control cables. Each piece was labeled in Cyrillic and mapped to sketches. Special attention was paid to the fuel system. The P-38's unusual arrangement, a main fuselage tank, 2 auxiliary wing tanks, and a self-sealing system suggested operational endurance far beyond Soviet long-range interceptors. Petrov noted the practicality. They have solved the range problem without sacrificing maneuverability. Even with fuel flowing through 4 separate circuits, there is redundancy. One hit to a wing tank will not immobilize the machine. A critical discovery came when examining the cockpit instruments. The altimeter, capable of reading up to 50,000 feet, confirmed Petrov's suspicions about sealing. The supercharger boost controls, entirely unknown in Soviet fighters, demonstrated the Americans' advanced understanding of high-altitude thermodynamics. Oxygen lines ran not only to the pilot but also to pressurized carburetors, ensuring stable combustion where air was thin. One afternoon, Senior Lieutenant Bogdanov, the political officer, brought a Soviet press release from Moscow. Reports of the United States deploying the P-38 inches, the Aleutians against Japanese forces. Casualty figures and combat reports hinted at a fighter capable of intercepting Japanese bombers at altitudes beyond the reach of conventional Soviet and Japanese aircraft. The reports were vague but consistent. Speed, sealing, and survivability were unprecedented. Over the next week, engineers experimented with temporary repairs. The first attempt involved unbending the central pod's seat rails and reconnecting flight control linkages. Hydraulic lines were replaced with improvised piping salvaged from downed Yak-9 seconds. Sparks flew when testing electrical systems, a risk in the freezing workshop, but by April 15th, preliminary checks suggested that at least some instruments and systems were operational. Petrov began to conceptualize the strategic implications. A P-38, if flown by a Soviet pilot, could reach Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, even heavy bombers, with minimal risk. But more importantly, it represented a learning opportunity, a chance to study American aeronautical engineering firsthand, to understand turbo-superchargers, high-altitude flight characteristics, and structural durability. By April 16th, the Soviet team had managed to remove the damaged propellers and mount temporary wooden placeholders for testing. Engineers noted the unusual torque of the Allison engines, which differed significantly from the inline and radial engines of domestic fighters. When the engines were briefly powered via ground start equipment, vibration and power delivery were analyzed. The results confirmed something extraordinary. Even under suboptimal conditions, the P-38's engines generated sufficient thrust to achieve takeoff if repaired fully. Petrov's log now included an observation that would later become a point of fascination for Soviet aeronautical research. This aircraft was designed not merely to survive combat, but to dominate in a domain our aircraft cannot reach. Its combination of range, ceiling, and concentrated firepower is unmatched. If we can unlock its secrets, it may redefine high-altitude interception for the Red Air Force. By April 17th, secrecy became paramount. The site was cordoned, with sentries posted to prevent Japanese reconnaissance aircraft or local villagers from observing the operation. Any mention of the P-38 was strictly verbal within the team. Written logs were coded, photographs classified, and sketches hidden in the engineers' personal logbooks. The presence of foreign aircraft in the Soviet Far East remained politically sensitive, and any misreport could have resulted in severe penalties. At night, Petrov would walk past the Lightning, observing the twin booms rising like sentinels under the pale moonlight. He reflected on the contrast between American and Soviet approaches. Americans built to endure, to strike from altitude, and to survive, the worst punishment. Soviets built to simplify, to repair quickly, and to fight in overwhelming numbers. The P-38 was a hybrid of both philosophies, complex but robust, powerful yet survivable. The implications were clear. The Soviet air forces had underestimated the heights at which modern fighters could operate. On the morning of April 18th, Petrov called a meeting with the senior mechanics and political officer. Plans were finalized for the first ground tests: propeller spins, fuel flow, engine synchronization, and high-speed taxiing along the frozen runway. No one yet dared suggest flight, but the anticipation was palpable. For the engineers of the 24th Mixed Aviation Regiment, the Lightning was no longer a wreck. It had become a teacher, a technological puzzle, and perhaps a weapon waiting to be reborn. As the first sledges carrying repaired control surfaces and engine parts were unloaded onto the airfield, Petrov noted in his logbook, "We have taken possession of the skeleton. Tomorrow, we will breathe life into it, and when it moves, we will see what heights it can truly reach, higher than anything we have ever known." The Khabarovsk airfield was quiet, blanketed by early spring snow that still clung stubbornly to the Siberian soil. The makeshift hangar housing the P-38 Lightning seemed almost out of place in the frozen expanse, a testament to foreign engineering amid the pragmatism of Soviet mechanics. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Petrov and his team had spent nearly 2 weeks meticulously cataloguing every component of the downed aircraft, improvising replacements where parts had been destroyed or frozen beyond repair. By April 21st, the day had arrived to awaken the Lightning from its enforced dormancy. Petrov oversaw the operation like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Captain Vasiliev and a cadre of mechanics were stationed around the engines. Ground starting equipment, a combination of field generators, heavy-duty cables, and hand-cranked magnetos had been assembled from the remnants of Yak 9 seconds and La 5 seconds. Every wire connection, every valve, was checked thrice. "Remember," Petrov warned, his breath forming clouds in the Siberian cold, "one mistake and we lose months of work, and perhaps the aircraft." The first phase was the propeller spin. The damaged wooden placeholders had been removed, and the repaired Hamilton Standard 3-bladed props mounted. Even stationary, the massive blades emitted a sense of latent power. Petrov noted in his log, "These propellers are more than just metal. They are instruments of energy. One turn of these blades moves the world around them." With the engines fueled, ignition procedures began. Mechanics and engineers leaned in, the frozen snow crunching under their boots, ears straining for the first growl of the twin Allison V1000, 710 seconds. The P-38, long dormant, seemed to sense the attention. Sparks danced across contacts, oil pumps whirred, and for the first time in nearly a month, life returned to the American fighter. The left engine coughed, sputtered, then roared with a low, steady growl. The right engine followed moments later. Ground vibration rippled through the airfield, and Petrov stepped back, the wind carrying the sound across the frozen expanse. The engineers studied the behavior of the engines with rigorous scrutiny. Instruments were installed temporarily in the cockpit to record manifold pressures, supercharger RPMs, and exhaust temperatures. The turbochargers, entirely novel to the Soviet team, spun freely, delivering pressurized air to the carburetors with smooth efficiency. Even under suboptimal fuel, a blend of Soviet 87-octane aviation gasoline substituted for the standard 100-octane, the engines achieved near-rated output. Captain Vasiliev, jotting notes on a clipboard, muttered in disbelief. "They've made these engines survive conditions that would kill ours. Heat, altitude, vibration, everything they endure is extraordinary. And yet, the Allison lives." The next step was taxi testing. Petrov's log recorded the cautious anticipation. "We are no longer merely observers. Tomorrow, the aircraft will breathe, move under its own power, and perhaps remind us why the Americans built these machines." The P-38, weighing over 12,000 pounds, loaded even without fuel and ordnance, rolled forward slowly. Engineers in the cockpit monitored oil pressures, propeller RPM, and brake response, while ground crews used ropes and sledges to guide the twin booms safely along the icy runway. Despite the snow and makeshift surface, the Lightning displayed remarkable stability. Torque effects, which had given Soviet pilots in preliminary studies cause for concern, were mitigated by the twin-engine configuration. Petrov's team noted how rudder input was minimal to counteract yaw, a revelation compared to the handling of their single-engine interceptors. By the afternoon, preliminary taxi tests were complete. Minor adjustments were made to control linkages, and the team took time to measure acceleration, brake response, and engine synchronization. What stood out most was the extraordinary thrust-to-weight ratio. Even without full fuel loads, the P-38 accelerated rapidly, its twin propellers slicing through the frigid air like knives. Petrov made the first public observation among his engineers. "This aircraft is built for more than mere survival. It is built to dominate the sky." The following day, April 22nd, the team prepared for engine revival to operational temperatures, a prerequisite for the first tentative flight. Lubricants, initially frozen in barrels outside the hangar, were warmed over portable stoves, then carefully pumped through the Allison engines. Petrov supervised the installation of temporary pressure gauges and telemetry lines running to the ground team, ensuring they could monitor performance without risking the pilot. The aircraft now appeared almost alive, instruments hummed, engines idled, and the P-38's twin booms stretched toward the sky like elongated fingers, seemingly itching to leave the earth. Lieutenant Mikhail Korolev, selected as the test pilot for the first partial engine runs, had trained primarily on Yak 9 seconds and La 5 seconds. The cockpit of the P-38, spacious and ergonomically advanced compared to Soviet fighters, impressed him immediately. Visibility was exceptional, a wide greenhouse canopy revealing the icy runway ahead. Rudder pedals and control sticks responded smoothly to input, with feedback far more precise than any Soviet aircraft he had flown. He noted the throttle response, linear, immediate, and powerful. The turbo-superchargers' effect on air delivery to the engines was unmistakable. Korolev could feel how the aircraft might maintain power at altitudes well beyond his previous experience. Partial engine runs began cautiously. Korolev engaged one engine at low RPM, then the second, gradually, bringing both to 1,200 revolutions per minute. Oil temperatures, manifold pressures, and supercharger boosts were recorded. Even under low-quality fuel and improvised ground start techniques, the Allison engines achieved stable operation, a result that amazed the entire team. Petrov, watching from the ground with his logbook in hand, noted, "This is more than resilience. This is engineering foresight. The Americans built a fighter that lives where others die." That evening, the team held a brief assembly, discussing the implications of the P-38's capabilities. Even in a partially restored state, it was evident the aircraft could reach operational ceilings far exceeding those of Soviet interceptors. The discussion turned to tactics. The Lightning's twin engines allowed sustained climbs without loss of power. Its durable airframe could withstand extreme maneuvering, and its concentrated firepower, though untested by Soviet weapons crews, promised extraordinary lethality. Petrov's notes grew increasingly reflective. We have underestimated what can be done in high-altitude air combat. Our doctrines are rooted in mass and simplicity. The P-38 shows that power and resilience, combined with precision, can achieve dominance even with a single aircraft. Over the next 2 days, minor repairs continued. Ground crews adjusted throttle linkages, replaced frozen bearings, and reinforced rudder cables. Fuel distribution lines were temporarily patched with Soviet alloys, and the team began studying the aircraft's control harmony, how ailerons, elevators, and rudder work together under the unique stress of a twin-engine design. The realization settled in among all present. When repaired and flown, the P-38 could operate at altitudes, speeds, and power levels that made conventional interceptors obsolete in direct engagement. By April 25, Petrov authorized the first high-speed taxi run. The P-38, engines at full power, roared down the icy runway, tires squealing, propellers slicing the Siberian air. Ground crews held their breath as the aircraft lifted slightly, the nose wheel barely leaving the surface, then settled back down. The stability and control at high speed were exceptional. Petrov allowed himself a rare smile. The Lightning was proving itself under conditions it had never faced before, frozen, improvised, and in the hands of engineers and pilots unfamiliar with its design. That evening, Korolev recorded his impressions. The power, the responsiveness, the sense of the aircraft as an extension of the pilot. I have flown nothing like it. If we can repair the landing gear and control cables fully, this machine will climb beyond anything in our skies. It is a revelation. Petrov summarized the week in his logbook. The P-38 is more than a captured aircraft. It is a masterclass in high-altitude engineering. If we can learn its secrets, the Red Air Force may achieve a capability previously thought impossible. Tomorrow, we attempt the first flight cautiously, deliberately, aware of both risk and potential. The chapter ends with the P-38 prepared for its first test flight, the Soviet engineers awed by its power, durability, and the altitude potential that would redefine their understanding of aerial warfare. Dawn broke over Khabarovsk with a pale orange glow filtering through the thin morning mist. The airfield, still partly snow-covered, was quiet except for the occasional clatter of tools and the measured breathing of mechanics checking instruments for the final time. Today, the P-38 Lightning, fully repaired and carefully inspected, was to leave the Earth for the first time under Soviet control. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Petrov oversaw preparations with a gravity that reflected both the risk and potential historic significance of the flight. Test pilot Lieutenant Mikhail Korolev approached the cockpit, bundled against the early spring chill. The twin Allison engines gleamed, their polished cowlings catching the dim sunlight. The canopy, recently repaired with reinforced glass panels, offered an unobstructed view of the frozen airfield and the vast Siberian forests beyond. Korolev ran through the checklist aloud, each item a reminder of both caution and ambition. Fuel lines secure, propeller pitch set to fine, control surfaces free, turbocharger oil pressures stable, oxygen system functional. Steady, Petrov instructed. The engines are strong, the airframe is strong, but this aircraft, it is unlike anything we have flown. He paused, surveying the mechanics gathered nearby. Remember, this is not just a flight. It is an experiment in altitude, endurance, and human understanding. Korolev eased the throttles forward. The engines roared, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the airfield and into the bones of every engineer present. Ground crews held ropes and monitored wheel alignment as the twin props whipped the cold air into a frenzied howl. Slowly, the Lightning began to move. Tires squealed across packed snow, dusting mechanics' boots with ice crystals. The aircraft accelerated smoothly, torque balanced by the twin-engine design. At roughly 60 miles per hour, Korolev gently lifted the nose. The tail left the runway next, and the P-38 climbed steadily, cutting through the low-hanging mist with the inevitability of a predator ascending its territory. Above the airfield, the aircraft exhibited remarkable stability. Korolev tested minor yaw and roll inputs, noting the linear response of the rudders and ailerons. Even under acceleration, control surfaces remained responsive without oscillation or unwanted deflection. The engineers on the ground exchanged astonished glances. While they had anticipated a competent aircraft, the Lightning surpassed even the most optimistic projections. Its mass, previously thought to be a liability, now provided an unprecedented sense of momentum and stability at low altitude. After a preliminary climb to 3,000 feet, Korolev engaged the turbo-superchargers. Pressures remained steady, the engines maintaining near-rated power despite the thinning air. As the aircraft passed 10,000 feet, the temperature plummeted, ice forming briefly on wing leading edges, but the Lightning powered through with astonishing resilience. Petrov observed instruments on the ground connected via telemetry, noting manifold pressures and RPMs that far exceeded the limits of contemporary Soviet fighters. At 10,000 meters, our best interceptors lose 25% of power, Petrov murmured to Captain Vasilyev. This aircraft, it doesn't even feel compromised. Korolev began a slow, deliberate climb to 20,000 feet. Oxygen levels were monitored meticulously. The pilot tethered to a supplemental supply as the cabin depressurized naturally at altitude. At this point, the twin V-1710 engines were operating within the stratosphere, where Soviet designs typically began, to fail. Control inputs remained smooth, with the aircraft responding almost as if the thin air did not exist. In his log, Korolev would later record, "The sensation is one of infinite capability. The controls are firm, the engines steady. We are climbing where no Red Air Force aircraft has climbed. It is as though the P-38 is born to this altitude." At 25,000 feet, Korolev tested maximum climb performance. The turbochargers, previously unfamiliar to the team, delivered consistent boost. Manifold pressures remained stable, and oil temperatures, carefully monitored, did not fluctuate beyond expected ranges. The Soviet engineers began to grasp the significance. The P-38's combination of airframe strength, engine power, and turbocharging allowed sustained operation at altitudes where even experienced La-5 and Yak-9 pilots would struggle to survive. Korolev tested rudder authority during a gentle turn. Unlike Soviet single-engine fighters, which often experienced sluggish response at high altitude due to thin air, the P-38 remained fully controllable. Roll rates and pitch authority were astonishingly linear, the twin-boom design providing stability that no Soviet interceptor could match. Petrov and his engineering team exchanged stunned glances. What had begun as a curiosity, a downed American aircraft in the Siberian wilderness, had revealed a technology far beyond the Red Air Force's current operational envelope. The true revelation came when Korolev initiated a dive from 28,000 feet. With the throttle open and propeller pitch set aggressively, the P-38 accelerated rapidly. Speeds exceeded 400 miles per hour in moments, with control surfaces remaining precise and responsive. For the first time, Soviet engineers could visualize how the Lightning could dominate engagements by combining high-altitude advantage with sheer speed and firepower. Korolev leveled off at 15,000 feet, and Petrov observed, "In any encounter at this altitude, our aircraft would be impotent. The Americans have built a Predator that operates where we cannot." Korolev began a series of test maneuvers to probe the structural integrity of the airframe. Tight turns, controlled rolls, and moderate negative G dives were executed without incident. Instruments recorded stress levels, and the P-38's massive structure absorbed forces far beyond anything experienced by Soviet aircraft. The combination of twin engines, robust spars, and durable landing gear created a platform capable of both rapid attack and sustained high-altitude operations. After 45 minutes of flight, Korolev began the descent. Landing procedures were cautious. The field, partially cleared of snow, presented risks to the P-38's nose gear. The aircraft touched down with authority, brakes engaged, and the mechanics held their breath as the heavy airframe decelerated smoothly, without ground looping or propeller strike. Engines powered down. The silence that followed was filled with disbelief and awe. Petrov made his log entry. The P-38 has exceeded expectations in every category. It climbs higher than our best, accelerates faster than anything we can produce, and responds to control input with precision unmatched in our inventory. This aircraft represents a leap in understanding. We must learn from it, adapt what we can, and acknowledge the limitations of our current doctrine. Over the following hours, the team debriefed the flight, reviewing telemetry, noting engine performance, and discussing tactical implications. They realized that if the Red Air Force could field even a fraction of these capabilities, high-altitude interception and escort operations would be fundamentally transformed. Yet, the P-38 was more than a tool. It was a revelation in philosophy. The Americans had emphasized durability, power, and altitude performance, sacrificing some agility for dominance where it mattered most. By nightfall, the Lightning was secured in the hangar. Engineers continued minor repairs, noting areas of wear from the first flight and preparing for more rigorous testing. Korolev, exhausted but exhilarated, reflected. We have glimpsed the future of air combat. Nothing we have flown prepares a pilot for the performance of this aircraft. It is not just a fighter. It is a symbol of what engineering and vision can achieve. Petrov, writing the final line in his log for the day, summarized the sentiment shared by all present. The P-38 is more than metal and fuel. It is a promise that altitude, speed, and resilience, when combined in harmony, create a machine that transcends our expectations. Tomorrow, we push it further. The sky belongs to the one who understands it first. Today, the Americans understood. Now, we must learn. The P-38 rested, engines cold but ready, a monument to ingenuity. In the snowy Siberian clearing, the Soviet engineers had discovered an aircraft that would redefine their understanding of high-altitude warfare, a machine that, for the first time, allowed them to reach heights they had only imagined. The morning sun cast a muted glow over Khabarovsk, reflecting off the lingering snow patches on the airfield. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Petrov and his team of engineers had spent the past week analyzing every instrument reading, every rivet, and every line of the P-38 Lightning's control cables. What had begun as curiosity had evolved into a meticulous scientific program. Each flight, a calculated step toward understanding a machine that surpassed every Soviet design by a wide margin. Today, they aimed to push the Lightning to its absolute operational limits. Lieutenant Mikhail Korolev prepared for the day's sortie with a mixture of anticipation and professional trepidation. He ran through the pre-flight checklist, reciting every step with practiced precision. Fuel levels, turbocharger pressures, propeller pitch, hydraulic fluid status, oxygen supply, each item was scrutinized as though the slightest oversight could render the aircraft irretrievably lost. The twin Allison V1000, 710 engines were idling smoothly, the familiar hum vibrating through the hangar floor. For Korolev, these were not just engines, they were the heart of a machine capable of redefining high-altitude flight. "Remember," Petrov instructed, his voice steady, carrying both authority and awe. "This is more than a test. Every maneuver you perform, every reading you take, will inform the future of our aviation doctrine. The Americans did not design this for show, they designed it to dominate. We are merely discovering the principles hidden in its design." Korolev eased the throttles forward, and the P-38 rolled down the icy runway with deliberate acceleration. Twin propellers carved the cold air into a sharp roar, echoing across the surrounding forests. The mechanics held their breath as the heavy airframe lifted smoothly, tail leaving the snow-dusted tarmac without incident. Within moments, the aircraft was climbing steadily, the turbochargers providing near sea-level performance even as the air grew thinner. By 15,000 feet, Korolev began a series of maneuvers designed to test both control, responsiveness, and structural limits. Gentle rolls and coordinated turns revealed the Lightning's remarkable stability. Unlike Soviet fighters, which often became sluggish at high altitude, the P-38 maintained precise, linear control. Petrov observed telemetry readings that confirmed every expectation: manifold pressures stable, oil temperatures within limits, and aileron and rudder responsiveness unwavering. At 20,000 feet, Korolev increased the climb angle. The sensation in the cockpit was almost surreal. He later described it in his log: "The aircraft climbs as if it is being pulled upward by an invisible hand. The engines respond instantly to throttle input. Controls remain precise. There is no hesitation, no loss of authority. We are in uncharted territory." Korolev tested the Lightning's ceiling, a limit that Soviet engineers had only theorized about in design documents. At 28,000 feet, he engaged the turbochargers to maximum, and the aircraft continued its ascent with remarkable efficiency. The cold bit through his gloves, and oxygen levels demanded constant monitoring, but the engines maintained rated power. Petrov scribbled notes furiously, recognizing that the Lightning's combination of mass, turbocharged engines, and twin-boom stability was unparalleled in their experience. The first real challenge came when Korolev initiated high-speed dives from the upper stratosphere. With the throttle open and propeller pitch set aggressively, the P-38 accelerated rapidly. Instruments recorded speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour within seconds, yet the airframe remained stable, a testament to Lockheed's over-engineering. Korolev noted the absence of control flutter or aerodynamic instability, phenomena that had plagued Soviet aircraft at similar speeds. The twin-engine layout distributed forces evenly, while the rigid wing spars absorbed the stress without deformation. "No aircraft in our inventory could survive this," Petrov whispered to Captain Vasilyev. "The Americans have built something fundamentally different." During one extended dive, Korolev performed a series of sharp rolls and banked turns to simulate evasive combat maneuvers. The P-38 remained predictable, its controls precise even under substantial aerodynamic load. Petrov observed the airspeed and G-force readings with a mixture of excitement and concern. The aircraft was operating within safe limits, yet these limits were significantly beyond what Soviet engineers had expected. The implications were clear. The P-38's performance at high altitude rendered existing Soviet interceptors effectively obsolete for engagements above 20,000 feet. Korolev conducted controlled engagements, simulating attacks on imaginary bombers and fighters. From the perspective of altitude and speed, he could dictate the terms of any engagement. Soviet fighters, designed for medium-altitude dogfighting, would be incapable of contesting this airspace effectively. Korolev returned to the airfield after nearly an hour in the stratosphere, engines warm but performing flawlessly. The landing was cautious. The snow-mottled runway presented risk, and the nose gear required careful alignment. With a gentle touch, the P-38 settled onto the tarmac, braking smoothly without ground looping or propeller strikes. The mechanics exhaled collectively, their expressions a mixture of awe and relief. Petrov immediately convened the engineering team. The debrief was detailed and intense. Every data point, from manifold pressures to control deflection, was analyzed. Conclusions were drawn rapidly. The P-38 Lightning represented a level of high-altitude performance unattainable by contemporary Soviet designs. The twin Allison engines with turbochargers, the reinforced airframe, and the aerodynamic efficiency of the twin-boom configuration combined to create a machine capable of sustained operations in the stratosphere. The team also recognized the tactical ramifications. In theory, a P-38 operating at its ceiling could intercept enemy aircraft without risk of counterattack. Its dive acceleration allowed it to strike quickly and retreat to safety at altitudes beyond the reach of Soviet or Axis fighters. Petrov made note of the implications for future doctrine. This aircraft is not simply superior, it is transformational. Tactics, pilot training, and interception strategy must evolve to accommodate machines of this capability. One P-38 can dominate airspace that would require 3 of our best fighters to contest. In the following days, Korolev conducted additional flights, progressively increasing altitude and duration. The P-38 demonstrated remarkable fuel efficiency at cruise altitude, the Allison engines, operating in harmony with the airframe to extend endurance far beyond Soviet expectations. Observations confirmed that the aircraft could maintain high-altitude patrols for several hours, a capability that would have been impossible with La-5 or Yak-9 fighters without frequent refueling. The Soviet engineers documented every detail: engine performance curves, climb rates, roll and yaw authority, structural stress readings, and even the P-38's unique handling characteristics during descents and dives. They noted the tactical advantages of twin-engine redundancy and the psychological effect of its massive silhouette at high altitude. Even minor damage to the airframe or engines did not significantly impair performance, a revelation that would influence future Soviet design philosophy. By the end of May 1944, Petrov's team had completed a series of rigorous high-altitude tests. The P-38 Lightning had exceeded every expectation, its performance rewriting the understanding of what a single-engine fighter could achieve, except, of course, that the Lightning was technically a twin-engine aircraft, yet it still outperformed single-engine designs by substantial margins. Petrov closed his log for the month. The P-38 is more than an aircraft. It is a study in engineering foresight. Its altitude capability, speed, and structural integrity surpass all Soviet fighters. We have learned that power and resilience, combined with aerodynamic efficiency, create an operational envelope that cannot be ignored. This machine has changed the way we must think about air combat forever. Korolev, sitting beside the P-38 the hangar, removed his flight helmet and smiled. He knew that what they had discovered in the Siberian wilderness was not merely an anomaly, but a glimpse into the future of aviation. The P-38 Lightning had proven itself as a high-altitude dominator, and in the hands of Soviet engineers and pilots, it would provide lessons that could reshape the air war in the Pacific and European theaters alike. The twin engines cooled in silence, but the promise of power they represented lingered. Above the snowy forests of Khabarovsk, the sky had been claimed, if only briefly, by an aircraft that defied expectations and forced those who encountered it to reconsider everything they thought they knew about flight. By early June, the Lightning had been fully restored to operational condition, and Petrov's engineering team moved to the next phase, comparative trials against the best Soviet fighters in the Far East inventory. A small contingent of La-5 FN and Yak-9 units had been assigned for the exercise. Their pilots briefed under strict secrecy. The Soviets were curious, almost apprehensive, about how their indigenous designs would fare against the American Lightning. Lieutenant Mikhail Korolev took the P-38 aloft first, climbing steadily to 20,000 feet. At the same time, Yak-9 pilots under Captain Sergei Ivanov ascended in staggered formation. The exercise began with simulated interception runs. Korolev's P-38, with its twin Allison engines running at full turbocharged output, accelerated effortlessly. The Lightning's climb rate and high-altitude handling immediately set it apart. La-5 FN aircraft struggled to maintain formation, their engines laboring as oxygen thinned. Petrov observed the telemetry and noted the striking disparities. The P-38 reached 25,000 feet with ease, where the Yak-9 was nearing its ceiling and already experiencing reduced maneuverability. Even at comparable altitudes, the Lightning retained superior speed. During simulated attack runs, Korolev could dictate the engagement. Diving from altitude, he reached speeds of nearly 400 miles per hour, forcing the Yak-9 seconds to attempt evasive maneuvers that proved ineffective. "It is as if we are observing two different classes of aircraft," Petrov recorded in his log. One designed for high-altitude dominance, the other optimized for agility at medium levels. The difference is not marginal, it is exponential. The team tested coordinated maneuvers, including mock dogfights, turns, and energy retention exercises. The Lightning's twin booms and mass distribution allowed for remarkable stability even under high-G maneuvers. While the Soviet fighters became progressively sluggish, their propeller-driven engines losing effectiveness in the thin air. The P-38's fire control sighting system, though manual, allowed for precise target acquisition during simulated passes, further highlighting technological gaps. Another revealing test involved extended high-altitude patrols. The P-38 maintained optimal cruise settings at 28,000 feet for over an hour, consuming fuel efficiently and showing no signs of engine stress. By contrast, Yak 9 seconds and La-5 FNs required constant throttle adjustments to avoid stalling, and pilots reported difficulty maintaining stable formation. Engineers recorded the data meticulously. Turbocharger efficiency, manifold pressure, and structural response all confirmed that the Lightning could sustain operations at altitudes previously unattainable by Soviet designs. By the day's end, the conclusions were undeniable. The P-38 Lightning was not simply superior in raw speed or altitude, it fundamentally redefined the parameters of aerial combat. Petrov's report summarized, "Against our best fighters, the P-38 maintains a decisive advantage in speed, altitude, and stability. Tactical doctrine must evolve. One Lightning can outperform 3 of our most capable aircraft simultaneously at high altitude. This discovery will inform both future aircraft development and strategic deployment." The trials ended, but the implications reverberated throughout the Soviet air defense forces. The Lightning had not only revealed the potential of American engineering, but also exposed the limitations of Soviet designs. The team would carry these lessons forward, blending our newfound knowledge with their own aircraft programs, forever changed by the lessons of a single crashed Lightning in the Siberian wilderness. Following the high-altitude trials, the Soviet engineering teams faced a new challenge, understanding not just the Lightning's performance, but the principles that allowed it to exceed anything in the Red Air Force's arsenal. Petrov convened a small circle of specialists in aircraft design, propulsion, and aerodynamics at the temporary hangar in Khabarovsk. The room was filled with technical schematics, detailed photographs, and the meticulously disassembled components of the P-38, all labeled and cross-referenced. "We are no longer examining a machine, we are examining a philosophy," Petrov told his colleagues. "Every system, every component is overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered. There is a logic here that transcends mere design, it is a reflection of industrial might." The first focus was the Allison turbochargers. Unlike Soviet superchargers, which relied on mechanically driven compressors, the Lightning's turbo units used exhaust-driven turbines to maintain full engine power at extreme altitudes. Engineers marveled at the efficiency and robustness of the system. Detailed schematics showed precision ducting through the engine nacelles and fuselage, a layout unlike anything in Soviet practice. Attempts to replicate the concept on Yak 9 engines immediately ran into material limitations and tolerances. The second revelation came in the airframe. The P-38's twin-boom structure provided both stability and redundancy, distributing stress across multiple load paths. Petrov's team examined the wing spars, control surfaces, and landing gear mounts. Every component exceeded nominal operational requirements. In particular, the Lightning's ability to absorb battle-damage engine hits, control cable severance, even punctured fuel tanks was noted as exceptional. Soviet engineers recorded hundreds of photographs, noting the unusual combination of strength and lightness. Weapons systems were equally enlightening. The central nose-mounted guns allowed for a concentrated convergence zone of fire without deflection corrections, a tactical advantage Soviet aircraft did not possess. Ammunition feed mechanisms, electrical heating systems, and synchronization with the airframe were all documented. Petrov noted that in combat, the Lightning's power meant pilots could focus on aiming, not compensating for recoil or aerodynamic instability. Despite the admiration, challenges loomed. Materials shortages, limited machining precision, and wartime constraints made direct replication impossible. Petrov instructed his teams to focus on principles rather than copy. "We cannot build Lockheeds in Siberia, but we can learn from their logic. Mass, power, and redundancy. The 3 pillars of survivability can guide our future designs." By the end of July 1944, the team had produced a preliminary report for the Air Defense Command. It recommended experiments with twin-engine designs for long-range interception, adoption of exhaust-driven superchargers for high-altitude performance, and reinforcement of structural components to survive damage that would down conventional aircraft. The Lightning had shifted from a curiosity to a blueprint, inspiring Soviet engineers to reconsider conventional approaches and to dream of fighters capable of meeting and exceeding the performance of any adversary. For Petrov and his men, the P-38 was more than a machine. It was proof that industrial foresight and engineering excellence could reshape aerial warfare. The Siberian snow, which had once hidden the wrecked Lightning, had become the cradle of a revolution in Soviet aviation thinking. By early September 1944, the clandestine hangar in Khabarovsk had become a hive of activity. The recovered P-38 Lightning, now partially restored to flight readiness, occupied the center of the facility, surrounded by workbenches laden with Soviet-engineered components inspired by its design. Engineers, mechanics, and test pilots moved through the hangar with deliberate precision, their movements dictated by both curiosity and the immense responsibility of handling an aircraft unlike any they had previously encountered. Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Petrov, now regarded not only as the squadron engineer, but also as the de facto project coordinator, surveyed the scene with a quiet intensity. The Lightning had already revealed secrets impossible to ignore. Turbo-supercharged engines capable of sustained high-altitude performance, an airframe that could absorb battle damage that would destroy Yakovlevs and Lavochkins, and a firepower configuration that made every encounter lethal for an adversary. But theory and observation could only go so far. The ultimate test lay in flight. Petrov's notes from the morning meeting reflected the stakes. "A machine," he wrote. "It is a demonstration of what is achievable when design is unconstrained by convention. Every decision is deliberate, every component engineered with purpose. Our task is not to replicate it, is to internalize and innovate." The first prototype, designated Sokol-1, had been completed after 6 weeks of feverish work. Its twin-engine configuration drew directly from the Lightning's lessons, though modified to accommodate available Soviet Allison analogues, created under extreme secrecy in the Far East Aviation Works in Vladivostok. The airframe blended Yak-9 elements with reinforced spars, and a rudimentary turbocharger system had been installed for the first time in Soviet service. The nose housed a concentrated gun cluster, though the number of weapons had been reduced to 3 20mm cannons due to supply constraints. Engineers were confident, however, that the principles of centralized firepower could be demonstrated even at a smaller scale. Test. Pilot Captain Nikolai Voronov, a veteran of 215 combat missions against Japanese and German aircraft, was assigned the first flight. Voronov was no stranger to experimental aircraft, but the Sokol-1 represented a different category entirely. The Lightning had taught him a crucial lesson. Speed, altitude, and firepower combined to create dominance. Now, in a machine influenced by that very philosophy, he would feel firsthand the potential to redefine Soviet air combat. The morning of September 12th dawned clear and cold. Snow blanketed the Siberian landscape, reflecting the rising sun in a way that made visibility almost blinding. Voronov performed the pre-flight checks meticulously, moving through a checklist twice as long as that for a standard Yak-9. The engines rumbled to life, a deep, throaty vibration that resonated through the hangar floor. Mechanics leaned back, listening, sensing the power restrained within the airframe. Petrov gave the final signal. The Sokol-1 rolled forward, along the snowy runway, its twin propellers slicing the cold air. Voronov felt the aircraft respond instantly. The reinforced airframe absorbed the torque, and the turbochargers began their work, maintaining engine output as the aircraft accelerated. Within seconds, the Sokol-1 lifted off, climbing steadily into the pale blue Siberian sky. Above 10,000 feet, the aircraft revealed its first revelation. Unlike Soviet fighters accustomed to losing power rapidly with altitude, the Sokol-1 maintained steady performance. Voronov pushed it higher, testing the limits cautiously. At 18,000 feet, the Lightning-inspired turbocharging system was clearly superior to any existing Soviet design. The engines hummed with controlled power, the twin booms vibrating in harmony with the central fuselage. Voronov noted in his log, "We have not yet reached maximum altitude." The aircraft responds predictably, as if aware of the pilot's intention. This is not merely flight. It is a conversation between man and machine.